The story begins in the late 19th century, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Rugged, wild, and unforgiving, these hills were both a shelter and a prison. To some, they were a place to escape the chaos of a modernizing America. For one family, the Jacksons, they became the stage for a human experiment that no one intended, but that destiny refused to ignore. It was around 1880 when Joseph Jackson, the family patriarch, led a small group of about 24 settlers into a valley so remote it was practically sealed off by nature itself. Jagged ridges rose like walls on all sides. Winters blanketed the region in snow so heavy that entire months could pass without a single visitor. And for Joseph, that was precisely the point. The Jacksons weren't seeking opportunity. They weren't chasing farmland or wealth. They were seeking something much more elusive: purity. Joseph declared that the world outside was corrupt, tainted, and dangerous. So he made a set of rules that would define the fate of every man, woman, and child born in that valley. No contact with outsiders. No marriages beyond the family circle. And above all, no leaving the valley. For Joseph, these rules weren't suggestions. They were law, and breaking them was nothing short of betrayal. At first, life in the valley looked ordinary enough. Wooden cabins dotted the land. The people grew their food, hunted in the woods, and clung to the traditions of faith that Joseph preached. But underneath the surface, something much darker was already forming. Because when you cut a family off from the rest of the world, you cut off their bloodline too. In the first years, the consequences were subtle. Marriages between first cousins became common. A child might be born with a cleft palate here, an extra finger there. Some infants struggled to survive, their tiny bodies failing before they even reached their first birthday. It was easy enough for the elders to explain these tragedies away as God's will. But nature is patient. With every generation, the valley's genetic pool shrank smaller and smaller until the walls Joseph had built around his family weren't just physical, they were biological. What began as an act of religious devotion was slowly mutating into something else, an invisible curse passed down through blood. The Jacksons didn't see it at first. They didn't want to. But the seeds of tragedy had already been planted. And as the decades turned, those seeds would grow into horrors that no one, not even Joseph himself, could have imagined. Because isolation doesn't just protect a family. Sometimes it dooms them. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Jacksons had survived their first generation in the valley. On the surface, life seemed steady. Crops grew in the fertile soil, children played in the streams, and the elders preached that their little world was chosen, protected from the corruptions of modern America. But beneath that quiet rhythm, shadows were forming. The first children of the valley already showed signs that something was wrong. A boy born with an extra thumb, a girl whose jaw never formed quite right, another who struggled to walk properly. To the Jackson elders, these weren't signs of biology. They were tests of faith. And in a world where no outside doctor ever set foot, those explanations were enough. But what no sermon could explain was the silent mathematics of genetics. With every marriage between cousins, recessive genes doubled their chances of showing themselves. Conditions that would have stayed hidden in a larger population now began surfacing like cracks in a dam. Infant mortality rose alarmingly. By 1910, nearly half of the babies born didn't survive past childhood. The ones who did often carried reminders of the bloodline's narrowing path: cleft palates, congenital heart defects, missing teeth, stunted growth. The children who struggled to learn or speak were simply considered slow. The Jacksons didn't know the word retardation. They only knew that these children were different, and in their closed-off world, different became the norm. Still, the rules remained. The elders enforced them with unshakable conviction. No contact, no outsiders, no escape. Girls as young as 13 were paired off with male relatives chosen by the council. Resistance was unthinkable. To question the rules was to question the very survival of the community. As the years passed, the outside world changed dramatically. Railroads expanded. Towns grew. Electricity lit up cities only a few ridges away. But in the valley, Time seemed to stand still. The Jacksons remained frozen in their own cycle, convinced that what they endured was righteous, even as the evidence of suffering multiplied. By the 1920s, the second generation was in full bloom, and the cracks in the bloodline had widened. Congenital deformities became more severe. Children were born with 6 fingers, malformed ears, and spines that curved unnaturally. Some babies didn't live long enough to be named. Their tiny graves dotted the hillsides, silent witnesses to a growing tragedy that no one outside the valley even knew existed. And still, Joseph Jackson's laws held fast. To the community, this suffering wasn't a curse. It was proof. Proof that their faith was being tested. Proof that purity was worth pain. But the truth was inescapable. Their bloodline was weakening. What had begun as a dream of holy isolation was quietly turning into a nightmare written in flesh and bone. And the worst was yet to come. By the 1930s, the Jackson family tree was no longer a tree at all. It had collapsed inward, twisted into a tangled knot of branches that circled back upon themselves. The cousins had married cousins, uncles had married nieces, and sometimes a single man could be both a brother and a nephew to the same child. The web was so dense, so confusing, that even later investigators would struggle to map it with precision. But for those inside the valley, this wasn't unusual. It was simply the way of life. The children growing up among the Jacksons believed their world was normal because everyone around them looked and lived the same way. And what did that world look like? Children with faces shaped by deformity, jaws that didn't quite fit, eyes spaced too wide apart, ears that folded in odd directions, limbs that bent unnaturally, fingers fused together or multiplied beyond the usual 5. In some cases, children struggled to walk, or to speak, or to even feed themselves. But because nearly everyone carried some kind of difference, the deformities blended into the rhythm of life. To an outsider, it would have been shocking. To the Jacksons, it was ordinary. The deeper tragedy, though, was invisible. It wasn't just the physical malformations. It was the silent erosion of the mind. Many children grew up with cognitive limitations. Some never learned to read or write. Others spoke in fragmented sentences or relied on gestures to communicate. Entire families developed their own ways of speaking, dialects born out of necessity because words failed them. In the winter months, the isolation was complete. The valley was cut off by snow, its people left with no reminder that another world even existed. And so the illusion of normality held strong. For the elders, this was proof of purity. They preached that their bloodline was chosen, cleansed from the impurities of outsiders. If a child was born weak, it was God's test. If a child was born blue, or silent, or twisted, it was a sign of divine mystery. Nothing was random. Nothing was science. But the truth was unavoidable. By the 3rd generation, nearly everyone in the valley shared the same genetic material. It was no longer just cousins marrying each other. It was people who were simultaneously cousins, uncles, and siblings. The valley had become a closed loop, and the genes had nowhere to escape. To the outside world, this might sound unimaginable. But to the Jacksons, it was all they knew. And therein lay the horror. Children raised to believe that deformity was natural, that suffering was ordinary, that there was no other way life could be. The web of kinship had done more than bind them together. It had trapped them in a cycle from which escape seemed impossible. And soon, this fragile world would take a strange and haunting turn, marked forever by a color that no one could ignore. By the middle of the 20th century, the Jacksons had entered their 4th generation. The physical deformities were no longer isolated cases. They were everywhere. But amid the crooked jaws, fused fingers, and twisted spines, another, almost otherworldly condition began to appear. Babies were being born with skin that wasn't pale, or pink, or ruddy but blue. At first, it was faint, almost like a shadow. Lips tinged with indigo. Fingernails carrying a bluish hue. But in some children, the condition deepened until their entire bodies seemed washed in shades of slate and midnight. To outsiders, it would have been alarming, even terrifying. To the Jackson elders, it became a mark, something they came to call the Jackson sign. Science would later reveal that this condition was methemoglobinemia, a rare genetic disorder caused by an enzyme deficiency that prevents blood from carrying oxygen properly. In other words, their veins ran with blood that could not fully do its job, starving tissues of oxygen and turning skin shades of blue. In larger populations, such a condition might appear once in many thousands of births. In the valley, it became disturbingly common. But the Jacksons didn't have words like enzymes or genetics. Instead, they wrapped the mystery in faith. The blue children, they said, were chosen, marked by God. Some believed the hue was a blessing, a sign of spiritual power. Others feared it was punishment. Either way, the color carried weight. And so, children with blue skin grew up under the gaze of superstition. Some were treated with reverence, whispered about as though their deformities made them closer to the divine. Others were hidden away, pitted, or even feared. Their condition wasn't understood. It was mythologized. This mythology only deepened as deformities became more grotesque. Alongside the blue skin came malformed jaws, widely spaced eyes, collapsed noses, and ears that never quite formed. In some, the faces bore so little resemblance to the human norm that they looked alien. But to the community, this was all explained away. God was testing them, purifying them, shaping them in ways beyond comprehension. Without outsiders to compare to, without doctors to explain otherwise, the abnormal became sacred. For the children, though, the lived reality was harsh. Many struggled to breathe, to eat, to survive winters when food and warmth were scarce. Infant mortality soared. By some estimates, nearly 6 out of 10 children died before their 5th birthday. And those who lived carried bodies marked by the inescapable toll of inbreeding. Outside the valley, America was moving into a new era: highways, televisions, the space race. But the Jacksons remained frozen in time, worshipping their own decay. The blue-skinned children became the emblem of that decay, a human symbol of what happens when isolation turns inward, when faith is twisted into control, and when nature's laws are ignored. And soon, the world they built around these myths would descend into something darker still, a nightmare that could no longer be hidden, even within the valley's walls. By the 1970s, the Jackson Valley was no longer just isolated. It was collapsing under the weight of its own bloodline. The signs were everywhere, written on the faces and bodies of its children. What had once been subtle deformities had now grown into full-blown abnormalities, so severe that survival itself seemed unlikely. The numbers tell part of the story. Fertility rates plummeted. Infant mortality soared to nearly 60%, an almost unthinkable figure for a community just a short drive from modern hospitals. For every 10 children born, more than half would not live past infancy. And those who did often carried deformities so extreme that some could hardly be recognized as human. There were children who could not walk. Others who never learned to speak, their mouths and palates too malformed to form words. Some lay bedridden from birth, unable to lift their own heads. And in a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, a place the community whispered about but seldom mentioned aloud, the most severely deformed were hidden away. Investigators would later call it the House of Special Children. To the elders, it was where God's harshest tests were kept out of sight. Inside, conditions were heartbreaking. Children, some chained to wooden frames, lay in silence or made guttural noises that the elders interpreted as sacred messages. To outsiders, they would have been cries of suffering. But to the Jacksons, they were oracles, voices of the divine trapped in broken bodies. It was a form of twisted faith, one that blurred the line between reverence and cruelty. As deformities worsened, the community's mythology deepened. Each mark, each distortion, was framed as a sign from above. A missing limb? A divine sacrifice? A fused skull? A sign of spiritual unity. Even the most grotesque conditions were woven into a narrative of purpose. In this way, the elders maintained control. If suffering was holy, then it was to question God himself. Meanwhile, the outside world remained oblivious. A few hunters and hikers wandered near the valley's edges, but the Jacksons stayed hidden, their fences and their fear of outsiders keeping their world sealed tight. Yet inside, the nightmare was undeniable. Mothers gave birth with dread, not knowing whether their children would live or what form they would take. Fathers followed the elders' orders blindly, marrying daughters to cousins, cousins to uncles, repeating the cycle because they were told it was the only way to keep their blood pure. But purity was the last thing left. By this point, almost everyone in the valley shared the same DNA. It was no longer family. It was a genetic echo chamber. The Jacksons lived in a world of silence, deformity, and death, a nightmare they believed was holy, even as it devoured them generation by generation. And then, in the midst of this decline, came a storm that would break through the valley's walls and carry one girl toward freedom. The year was 1983, and the Jackson Valley had endured more than a century of isolation. The rules were the same, the walls were unbroken, and the nightmare seemed destined to continue forever. But then came Mary. Mary Jackson was just 16, a girl born into the cycle like every generation before her. She grew up in the shadows of deformity, surrounded by siblings and cousins who could barely speak, by elders who controlled every aspect of life, and by the constant reminder that there was no world beyond the valley. But Mary had something most others didn't: curiosity, a restless spark. That spark found its chance one night when a storm ripped across the Appalachian ridges. Thunder shook the valley, rain pounded the ground, and winds tore through the wooden fences that marked the boundaries of their prison. For the first time in Mary's life, there was a gap, an opening. She made a decision that would change everything. While others huddled in their cabins, praying for the storm to pass, Mary ran. She slipped through the damaged fence, her heart pounding, her feet sinking into the wet earth. Behind her, the only world she had ever known. Ahead of her, a forest alive with lightning. For hours she stumbled through the storm, guided by nothing but desperation. And when she finally reached the outskirts of a small town, soaked and trembling, the sight of electric lights must have seemed like a vision from another universe. When Mary told her story, the townspeople could hardly believe her. Generations living in total isolation? Forced marriages? Children born with deformities, too extreme to imagine? It sounded like the plot of a horror novel. But Mary was living proof. She bore the physical signs of her bloodline, and her words carried the raw weight of truth. The authorities listened, at first skeptical, then alarmed. And soon, an investigation was launched. In February of 1983, police officers, doctors, and social workers set out into the mountains to find the valley Mary had described. What they discovered exceeded even her account. A community of nearly 240 people, most with visible deformities. Families who had never seen electricity, never ridden in a car, never even watched television. Primitive cabins. No running water. No medical care. And woven into it all, a hierarchy of elders who still preached the same laws Joseph Jackson had declared a century before. The world Mary had fled was real, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Her escape had broken the spell of silence. For the first time, outsiders were inside. The nightmare was no longer hidden in the valley. It had been exposed, and the full truth was about to come crashing into the light. When authorities entered the Jackson Valley in 1983, they expected hardship. Poverty, perhaps. Malnutrition. Maybe a fringe religious sect living off the grid. What they found instead was something far more disturbing, a living relic of human isolation. Nearly 240 people called the valley home. And almost every one of them bore the mark of generations of inbreeding. Some had extra fingers curled like claws. Others had jaws so underdeveloped they struggled to chew. Eyes misaligned. Limbs bent at unnatural angles. Children hobbled barefoot through the mud, many unable to speak in words at all, communicating instead with sounds and gestures. Investigators realized quickly that this was not just a community, it was an involuntary genetic experiment carried out over 7 generations. The elders resisted fiercely, insisting that their way of life was chosen, sacred. Ezekiel Jackson, one of the oldest leaders, declared, "Our blood is pure. We are strong against the corrupted world." But standing before the investigators, his body frail and twisted, the words rang hollow. Then came the most haunting discovery of all. At the edge of the settlement stood a cabin the locals called the House of Special Children. When investigators stepped inside, the air grew heavy with silence and the smell of rot. There, they found children confined to wooden frames, some chained to rudimentary beds. Their deformities were so severe that many could not feed themselves, speak, or control their own bodies. Some stared blankly at the strangers, others cried softly, their voices weak and broken. The Jackson elders had called these children blessed oracles, whose inarticulate noises were treated as divine messages. But to the doctors and social workers who witnessed the scene, it was something else entirely. Neglect wrapped in superstition, cruelty disguised as faith. The deeper investigators looked, the darker it became. They unearthed crude records, births, deaths, and marriages scribbled in an old Bible. Many names were repeated, tangled in ways that made family relationships nearly impossible to follow. Children were often listed as child of the valley, rather than linked to specific parents, an attempt to obscure just how close the kinship lines had become. As if the physical reality weren't shocking enough, there were whispers of darker practices. Testimonies suggested that women from outside towns had been lured or taken into the valley over the decades, used to renew the bloodline. Some never returned home. To local families, unexplained disappearances suddenly took on chilling new meaning. For the medical teams, the valley was like stepping into a nightmare from a textbook, except here it was real, breathing, and pleading for help. Doctors encountered conditions so rare they'd only ever read about them. Others they had never seen before at all. It was as though nature, pushed to its limits by isolation, had created combinations of genetic mutations unseen anywhere else in the world. The shocking discovery was clear. This was not just a forgotten community. This was the collapse of a bloodline, playing out in slow motion, hidden in the mountains for over a century. And what scientists were about to uncover next would shake the medical world to its core. When the first medical teams began examining the Jackson family in 1983, they quickly realized they weren't just treating patients. They were documenting something unprecedented. Never before in modern history had a population been so genetically confined for so many generations. What they found stunned even the most seasoned doctors. The numbers alone were staggering. 98% of the valley's inhabitants displayed some form of genetic disorder linked to inbreeding. Among children under 10, the figure was 100%. Every child carried not just one rare condition, but multiple, stacked mutations that magnified one another, producing deformities and syndromes no doctor had ever seen. Common anomalies like cleft palates or polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, were only the beginning. Doctors diagnosed Apert syndrome, with its fused skull plates and claw-like hands. Meckel syndrome, where brain tissue bulged through malformed skulls. Spines twisted by scoliosis. Hearts riddled with defects. And alongside these known conditions were brand-new combinations of mutations, so unique they defied existing medical classifications. For the geneticists, it was as though nature had written new entries in the medical dictionary, all within this single valley. Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, one of the geneticists on the team, later described it as an involuntary experiment, the kind no ethics board would ever approve, yet here it was, written in human lives. She calculated that in the most recent generations, some Jacksons shared more than 70% of their genetic material. In normal populations, even siblings share about 50%. These levels, she said, should be impossible in a viable human community. And yet, here they were, alive but broken. The science was chilling enough. But then came Jacob Jackson. Just 19 years old, Jacob stood out for his relatively mild deformities and sharper mind. Unlike many of his peers, he could read. Years earlier, he had stumbled across a basic biology book among supplies the elders brought back from nearby towns. That book cracked open his world. Jacob confided to investigators that he had long suspected something was wrong. And then he revealed something even darker. The elders knew. Hidden in their possession were newspaper clippings and scientific articles about genetics and heredity. They weren't ignorant. They were deliberate. Jacob claimed they even held private discussions about which pairings might produce fewer monsters, as they cruelly called the children most severely affected. The revelation shifted the investigation from tragedy to potential crime. This wasn't just the blind outcome of faith and isolation. This was manipulation, control, a system knowingly perpetuated, even as children were condemned to suffering from birth. For the scientific community, the Jackson case became a grim treasure trove of data, a window into the extreme consequences of collapsing genetic diversity. But for the investigators on the ground, it was something else. A moral reckoning. Each diagnosis wasn't just a statistic. It was a child, a family, a human life shaped by decisions made generations ago. And soon, the question would no longer be about what science could learn, but how, if at all, these people could be saved. By late 1983, the Jackson case was no longer just a medical investigation. It had become a moral emergency. The question was no longer what happened in the valley, it was what now. The state faced an almost unimaginable task: how to reintegrate an entire community that had been cut off for more than a century. The logistics alone were staggering. None of the valley's inhabitants had birth certificates, medical records, or legal documents of any kind. Many didn't even know their own ages. Authorities had to start from scratch, creating new identities for nearly 240 people who, in the eyes of the outside world, had never legally existed. And then there were the children. Every single one of them carried multiple genetic conditions, many requiring urgent treatment. Surgeons worked to correct cleft palates so children could eat and speak. Orthopedic specialists operated on twisted spines and fused limbs. Pediatricians treated congenital heart defects. For some, it was too late. But for others, medicine offered a chance at survival they never would have had inside the valley. Psychologists, too, faced a monumental challenge. Imagine growing up believing the outside world was evil, only to be thrust into it overnight. Many older Jacksons simply couldn't cope. Some withdrew into silence. Others grew violent, lashing out at caregivers they didn't understand. A significant number were eventually placed in long-term institutions, unable to adjust to a reality far larger and stranger than the valley they had known. For the children, however, there was hope. Those with milder cognitive impairments showed remarkable resilience. Once freed from the cycle, many adapted quickly, eager to learn, eager to live. Mary Jackson, whose escape had exposed the valley, became their shining example. After medical treatment and therapy, she returned to school, graduated, and later became an advocate for people with genetic disorders. Her courage, once born of desperation, became a beacon of possibility. But the intervention wasn't without controversy. Some argued the state had no right to dismantle a community, however dysfunctional. Others believed authorities had waited too long, leaving generations to suffer needlessly. And hanging over it all was the question of justice. Should the elders, the men who had enforced the marriages, hidden the truths, and controlled the bloodline, be held accountable? In the end, only a few were prosecuted. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders, deemed fully aware of the harm they had caused, faced charges of child abuse and criminal negligence. The rest, judged to have diminished mental capacity from the very system they upheld, were spared. The law could punish only so much. The true sentence had already been served by generations of children born into suffering. As 1984 began, the Jackson Valley stood empty for the first time in over a century. The cabins, the fields, even the house of special children, all abandoned. The nightmare was over, but the scars remained, etched into every survivor who carried the valley within their blood. Breaking the cycle had cost everything, but at last it had been broken. When the Jackson Valley was finally emptied in 1984, the mountains closed in on silence. For the first time in over a century, no voices echoed from the cabins. No smoke rose from chimneys. The cycle had ended. But the story of the Jacksons was only beginning to ripple outward. For the survivors, the years that followed were a journey of transformation. Some children, once hidden away in shame, now walked into classrooms for the first time. They stumbled through new words, marveled at electric lights, and tasted food they'd never known existed. A few grew strong enough to live independently, to start families of their own. Others, too deeply scarred by the past, remained in institutions where they could receive the constant care they needed. Their lives were difficult, but at least no longer hidden. Mary Jackson became the voice of her people. The girl who had once fled through a storm to escape captivity grew into a woman who stood before crowds, reminding the world of the dangers of unchecked isolation and blind obedience. She told her story not with bitterness, but with purpose, so no other child would be condemned to suffer as she had. Science, too, carried the legacy forward. Geneticists used samples from the Jackson family to identify more than 40 rare conditions, some of which had never been documented before. These discoveries helped create early tests for detecting hidden genetic risks, tools that are still used today in hospitals around the world. In a tragic irony, the suffering of the Jacksons contributed to the saving of countless lives beyond their valley. The land itself was transformed as well. The state turned the valley into a natural reserve, its cabins dismantled, its fields reclaimed by forest. At the entrance stands a simple memorial, a plaque inscribed with a message, in memory of those who lived and died in isolation, and as a reminder of our duty to protect the vulnerable. Visitors who walk the trail pass quiet graves, many of them belonging to children, silent testaments to what happens when faith, fear, and genetics collide. Policymakers also took note. In the years that followed, states across America introduced monitoring programs for closed, high-risk communities. The balance between religious freedom and child protection grew sharper, more urgent. The Jackson case became a cautionary tale, reminding society that behind closed doors, hidden worlds can exist, worlds where suffering multiplies unseen.